At 74 years old, Opal Marie Devereaux sat in a chair that felt like a throne of ice, while the air in the mahogany-paneled conference room in downtown Tupelo turned into a thick, suffocating fog. For 39 years, she had been the invisible marrow in the bones of the family construction business, waking at 4:30 in the morning to balance ledgers and file taxes, while her husband Nelson took the glory and the gold. Now across a table that cost more than her first house, Nelson leaned back with a gold pen in his hand, a man of 76 who looked like success but smelled of betrayal. Next to him sat Rhonda Capps, the former employee who had spent years mocking the silver in the hair of Opal while secretly measuring the windows of the family home for new curtains. There was no preamble and no mercy, as a thin blue folder was slid across the polished wood by a man Opal had once taught to tie his shoes and read the stars. It was her own son Gavin, a corporate attorney with a heart made of billable hours and cold statutes, who looked at his watch as if the entire life of his mother was just a line item in a busy Tuesday afternoon. Gavin did not look his mother in the eye as he explained with a practiced clinical detachment that the $310,000 a year business was considered separate property under the laws he had spent his career mastering. Every hour Opal had spent in that windowless back office, every tax filing she had perfected to keep the empire from crumbling, was being erased with the stroke of a pen. When Opal asked about the retirement fund she had painstakingly managed, Rhonda let out a sharp, jagged laugh that cut through the silence like a blade on glass. Nelson did not even flinch as he signed his name with a flourish, never once glancing at the woman who had used her own $15,000 inheritance to buy the very first delivery truck for the business back in 1987. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of old money being stolen in broad daylight. Opal felt a tremor start in her fingertips, a violent shaking that spoke of decades of ignored exhaustion and suppressed rage, so she sat on her hands to keep the predators at the table from seeing her break. The final blow came not from the loss of the business, but from the cold plastic of a check for a measly $23,000 and a set of keys to a rusted 10-year-old sedan. This was the sum total of nearly 4 decades of silent dedication. While Nelson kept the $2.2 million estate and every liquid asset they had built together, Gavin informed her she had exactly 48 hours to vacate the family home before the locks were changed and the past was hauled to the curb. Even her daughter Joy had called earlier, not to offer a bed or a shoulder, but to warn Opal not to make a scene because a public divorce would ruin the social optics of the family. In that moment, Nelson looked at her with a smirk and told her that she should not look so surprised, because she had spent 40 years counting the money he earned, and she should have known she would not get to keep any of it. Opal walked out of that room in a silence so profound, it felt like the world had stopped breathing, her head held high, even as her heart felt like it was being crushed in a vice of pure, unadulterated grief. What Nelson and his pack of vultures did not realize was that they were not discarding a broken tool, but releasing a force of nature they no longer had the capacity to understand. As Opal sat in the driver's seat of that rattling Ford Taurus, staring at the check that was an insult to her very existence, she felt a strange, cold clarity wash over her. The world saw a stoic 74-year-old woman who was being sent off to wither away in some forgotten corner of Mississippi. They thought they had left her with nothing, but they had forgotten that Opal was a mathematician who knew how to find value in the gaps and patterns that others ignored. That afternoon, while browsing a tax-delinquent website in the dim light of a public library, she found a listing for a house in Neshoba County for exactly $7. The description warned of a catastrophic structural floor failure and a curse that had kept the property vacant for 80 years, but to Opal a house with a broken floor was a perfect reflection of her own life. She clicked by without a second thought, unaware that the day she lost everything was actually the first day of her real life, and that what was waiting beneath those warped boards would eventually make the millions of Nelson look like pocket change. If you have ever felt like your years of hard work were being tossed aside like worthless trash, or if someone has ever tried to make you believe that you are too old to start over, then the story of Opal is the mirror you need to look into today. Have you ever been told that your dedication was worth nothing by the very people you sacrificed everything to build up? If you have ever looked at a broken situation and seen a hidden opportunity that no one else could perceive, you need to hear exactly what Opal discovered when she pried up the first plank of that $7 cottage. Subscribe now, because stories like this prove that the people who underestimate you are always the ones who end up losing everything in the end, and I promise that the justice waiting at the end of this road is more satisfying than you can possibly imagine. Welcome to the chronicle of the woman they tried to bury, only to realize she was a seed, and this is just the beginning of her harvest. To understand how Opal Marie Devereux ended up in that cold mahogany room in Tupelo, you have to go back to a humid Tuesday in October of 1987, when she was 35 years old and still believed that brilliance was a currency that could buy a woman a seat at the table. She was a woman who saw the world in prime numbers and elegant equations, a gifted mathematician who had walked away from a full scholarship to a state university to care for her ailing mother. When she met Nelson Vance Devereux at a local town hall meeting, he was a man drowning in a sea of red ink and poorly managed inventory, struggling to explain why his small construction supply business was failing. Opal had watched him from the back row, her silver pen moving across a yellow legal pad like a surgeon's scalpel, and afterward she had walked up to him with a quiet confidence and showed him exactly where his leaks were. She didn't see a failing businessman in that moment, but a man who looked at her with a desperate kind of reverence and promised that if she helped him build his empire, they would be equal partners in every sense of the word. The first sacrifice was the hardest to see because it was wrapped in the beautiful packaging of a shared future and the scent of new beginnings. Just 6 months after they were married, Opal turned down a significant promotion at a regional bank, a position that would have made her one of the youngest female executives in the state. Nelson told her that the business needed her more, that her mind was too valuable to be wasted on someone else's profits, and that her name would be right next to his on everything they built. To prove her commitment, Opal took her $15,000 inheritance from her grandmother, a sum she had intended to use as a down payment on a small cottage of her own, and used it to buy the company's very first heavy-duty delivery truck. She still remembered the smell of the new rubber tires and the way the morning sun glinted off the chrome as she watched Nelson drive it away for the first time. She felt like a silent architect laying the cornerstone of a cathedral, never realizing that she was actually building the very walls that would one day become her prison. She established a routine that would remain unchanged for nearly 4 decades, a rhythm of labor that became the heartbeat of Devereux Construction Supplies. Every single morning she woke up at 4:30 while the world was still draped in the blue shadows of pre-dawn to handle the inventory, the payroll and the complex tax filings that kept the business solvent. She worked in a windowless back office that smelled of stale coffee and old paper and diesel fumes, while Nelson occupied the front office with the large windows and the expensive leather chairs. She balanced the ledgers. She filed the taxes. She managed the vendors. She tracked every single penny that flowed through the company accounts, ensuring that the books were so perfect that even the most eagle-eyed auditor could find no fault. While Nelson was out at long 3 martini lunches, shaking hands with contractors and taking the public glory, Opal was sitting at a metal desk eating a plain ham sandwich and making sure the foundation of their life remained unshakable. By the 5th year of the marriage, the children began to arrive, and Opal's workload did not decrease, but simply shifted into a more frantic and exhausting gear. Gavin was a colicky baby who only slept when he was held, yet Opal found a way to balance him on one hip, while her free hand moved across the keys of a heavy mechanical calculator with the precision of a concert pianist. She was the one who remembered every doctor's appointment, every school play, and every scraped knee while Nelson was busy, becoming the face of success in Tupelo. She believed that her silence was a form of strength, and that her dedication would eventually be rewarded with the same loyalty she gave so freely. She was building a legacy for her children, believing that the stability of the family bank accounts was the only shield they would ever need against the harshness of the world. She never stopped to ask why her name was absent from the deeds of the properties they began to acquire, or why Nelson started referring to the business as mine instead of ours in front of their growing circle of friends. When the 10th anniversary arrived, a subtle but devastating shift occurred in the power dynamic of the household that Opal chose to ignore out of a sense of duty and fear. Nelson stopped asking her to attend the prestigious business dinners and holiday galas, claiming that she was too tired or that she would be bored by the shop talk of the other men. He began to tell her that she looked like the struggle while he needed to look like the success, and he started suggesting that her silver hair and modest cotton dresses were an embarrassment to the image he was trying to project. Opal stayed home in the quiet rooms of their expanding estate, cleaning the marble floors and cooking elaborate three-course meals that often went cold because Nelson was out late celebrating another big contract. She told herself that she was the invisible marrow in the bones of the family, and that without her, the entire structure would collapse. But the truth was that Nelson was learning how to walk without her, while still using her strength to stay upright. By year 15, the children had begun to absorb their father's arrogance, like sponges soaking up a toxic spill, and the house became a place of cold hierarchies. Gavin was already showing the calculating and elitist tendencies that would eventually lead him to a career in corporate law, looking at his mother, not as a parent, but as a piece of household furniture that occasionally spoke. Joy was becoming a social climber, who viewed her mother's calloused hands and sensible shoes with a mixture of pity and disdain, constantly asking for money for designer handbags while mocking the way Opal saved every rubber band and paperclip. Opal found herself becoming a ghost in her own home, a woman who was expected to provide everything, but was allowed to possess nothing. She watched as Nelson bought himself a luxury SUV, while she continued to drive an old station wagon with a rattling tailpipe, telling her that the business couldn't afford a second high-end vehicle that year, despite the $310,000 in annual revenue she was painstakingly recording. Her abandoned dream of becoming a professional archivist or a historian of the Deep South was buried under layers of payroll sheets and utility bills. She had once loved the way old stories could be preserved and protected, but now she was merely preserving the wealth of a man who no longer bothered to look her in the eye when he spoke. She found solace in the meticulous nature of her work, taking a strange pride in the fact that she was the only one who truly understood the complex machinery of the business. She was a woman who knew the exact cost of a ton of gravel and the precise interest rate on every loan they carried, yet she did not know the value of her own soul in the eyes of the man she had married. She was so focused on making sure the books balanced that she didn't notice the emotional debt Nelson was accumulating, a debt he had no intention of ever paying back. Around the 20th year of the marriage, Nelson moved his primary office to a separate building across town under the guise of expansion, but Opal knew it was a move toward isolation. He told her that he didn't want to see her work anymore, that the sight of her leaning over those dusty ledgers made him feel old and reminded him of their humble beginnings. He hired younger, flashier staff to handle the client interactions, and the marketing, leaving Opal in her windowless back room to manage the dirt while he enjoyed the gold. It was during this period that Opal noticed a strange tax anomaly in the company, records a small but consistent payment for a plot of land in Neshoba County that didn't seem to belong to any of their active projects. When she asked Nelson about it, he snapped at her, telling her it was a useless piece of swampland he'd acquired in a bad debt settlement, and that she was to pay the taxes and never mention it again. She obeyed him, as she always did, burying the deed in a folder marked miscellaneous, never imagining that this small piece of discarded paper would one day be the key to her salvation. By year 30, the atmosphere of the business had turned predatory with the arrival of Rhonda Capps, a sales manager, who looked like the success Nelson craved and who smelled of expensive perfume and ambition. Rhonda did not hide her contempt for Opal, mocking her wardrobe and her discipline behind her back, while pretending to be a supportive colleague to her face. Nelson began taking business trips that lasted through the weekends, and Opal would find receipts for jewelry she never wore and restaurants she never visited tucked into the pockets of his suits. She stayed silent, believing that if she just worked harder and kept the family legacy intact, the storm would eventually pass. She was a woman of 70 now, her silver hair kept in a disciplined bun, her hands steady, even as her heart began to fray at the edges. She watched as Joy and Rhonda became friends, shopping for curtains together, while Opal was still in the back office making sure the payroll checks for the very woman who was stealing her life would clear on Friday afternoon. Gavin had become a successful attorney by then, and he would often visit the office not to see his mother, but to consult with Nelson on how to restructure the company's legal titles. Opal would see them through the cracked door of her office, their heads bent together over blueprints and contracts, their voices hushed and urgent. She felt a cold dread beginning to pool in her stomach as she realized that her son was helping his father erase her from the history of the company she had helped build with her own inheritance. She found herself checking the safe in the middle of the night, looking for the original documents of the business, only to find that the titles had been moved to a private lockbox she no longer had access to. The seeds of the betrayal were being planted in the dark corners of the law, and Opal was too tired and too loyal to believe that her own flesh and blood would ever truly leave her with nothing. The physical toll of 39 years of silent dedication was written in the slight stoop of her shoulders, and the way her fingers cramped after hours of data entry. She wore a faded cardigan that had seen better decades, a garment that felt like a shield against the cold indifference of her family. She remembered the early days when she and Nelson would share a thermos of coffee on the back of that first delivery truck, talking about their dreams for the future. Now they lived in a $2.2 million estate, but they hadn't shared a real conversation in over a decade. Nelson treated her like a human calculator, a machine that didn't need maintenance or affection as long as it kept producing the numbers he needed to maintain his lifestyle. She was a stranger in a house she had spent 40 years cleaning, a woman who had sacrificed everything for a family that viewed her as an outdated piece of office equipment. In the final months before the divorce, Opal found another curious entry in the archives, a set of old survey maps that Nelson had hidden in the back of a filing cabinet. They were dated 1947 and detailed a property in Neshoba County known as the Boudreaux Cottage, a name that meant nothing to her at the time. She noticed that Nelson had been paying a private security firm to monitor the perimeter of that property for years, a detail that didn't align with his claim that the land was a worthless swamp. She tucked the maps into her own private folder, a small act of rebellion she couldn't quite explain even to herself. She didn't know then that she was holding the map to a secret that had been buried for 80 years, or that the man she called her husband was terrified of what was hidden beneath the warped floorboards of that Cypress cottage. The morning of the meeting in the mahogany conference room, Opal had woken up at her usual time of 4:30 a.m. and made a pot of coffee in the silent kitchen of the estate. She had looked out the window at the garden she had tended for 39 years, the roses she had pruned and the herbs she had harvested, and felt a strange sense of finality. She knew that the thin blue folder Gavin was carrying contained the end of her life as she knew it, but she also knew that the numbers in her ledgers never lied, even when the people did. She had spent her life counting the money Nelson earned, but she had also been counting the hours of her own silence, and she was beginning to realize that the balance was about to shift. As she put on her sensible shoes and smoothed her silver hair, she felt a flicker of the mathematician. She used to be a woman who knew that even the most complex equation eventually had to be solved. What Nelson and Rhonda and Gavin did not realize as they sat in that air-conditioned room with their gold pens and their cold statutes was that Opal Marie Devereaux had spent 40 years learning how to survive on the margins. They thought they were discarding a woman who had no value, but they were actually releasing a woman who knew every secret, every leak, and every hidden asset of the empire they were so eager to steal. They had forgotten that a foundation doesn't just hold a house up, it knows exactly how to make it fall. As Opal sat there staring at the insult of a $23,000 check, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost, but about the $7 house in Neshoba County that was waiting for her in the humidity of the Mississippi woods. She was ready to stop being the invisible marrow and start being the force of nature they had foolishly underestimated for 39 long years. But as she walked toward the heavy glass doors of the law firm, she couldn't help but wonder if the floor of that $7 cottage was the only thing in her life that was truly broken. She had no idea that the warped boards of the Boudreaux Cottage were being pushed upward by something far more valuable than the millions Nelson was hoarding in his private accounts. The air outside was thick with the scent of approaching rain, and as she stepped into the heat of the Tupelo afternoon, she felt the first true spark of a fire that had been smoldering under the ice for decades. What she didn't know was that the secret hidden in the dirt of Neshoba County was already beginning to scream for justice, and that the man who had stolen her past was about to find out exactly what happens when a mathematician decides to settle the score. For every debt there is a payment, and for every silence there is a reckoning that can shake the very earth beneath your feet. The blue folder was not merely a collection of legal documents, but a guillotine blade, sliding across the polished mahogany table with a sickeningly smooth hiss. Opal stared at the signature line, where her life was being surgically removed from the empire she had sustained for 39 years, while her son Gavin checked his expensive platinum watch with a gesture of profound boredom. There was a clinical coldness in the way he adjusted his silk tie as he explained that, under the laws of the state, the business was considered separate property because her contributions were never formalized in a written contract. The room smelled of expensive furniture polish and the metallic tang of high-end air conditioning. But to Opal, it felt like a tomb where the oxygen was being replaced by the arrogance of the men sitting across from her. She looked at Gavin, the boy she had stayed up with through 1,000 fevers, and felt a chill that went bone deep as she realized he wasn't looking at his mother, but at a legal obstacle he had finally cleared. The indifference in his eyes was a sharper betrayal than any spoken word, because it signaled that in his world she had already ceased to exist as a human being with feelings or history. Every hour Opal had spent in that windowless back office, calculating the margins on ton after ton of gravel, was being erased by the stroke of a gold pen held by a man who had forgotten the taste of struggle. Nelson signed the final decree with a flourish that was almost celebratory, never once lifting his gaze to meet the eyes of the woman who had used her own $15,000 inheritance to buy the very first delivery truck for his failing business in 1987. Sitting next to him, Rhonda Capps leaned forward, her sharp features illuminated by the morning sun, and let out a jagged laugh that echoed off the paneled walls when Opal asked about the retirement fund she had painstakingly managed. Rhonda's perfume was a cloying floral scent that seemed to stake a claim on the very air Opal was trying to breathe, and she watched with a smirk as Nelson reached over to pat the younger woman's hand in a gesture of intimate possession. The cruelty was not just in the loss of the money, but in the presence of the mistress at the private legal proceedings, a calculated layer of humiliation designed to prove that Opal was no longer the queen of the castle, but a discarded relic to be hauled away with the trash. Gavin's voice was a monotonous drone as he began the process of stacking the layers of their collective cruelty one on top of the other until the weight was almost unbearable to witness. He informed his mother that since she had no legal claim to the $310,000 in annual revenue, she would be receiving a one-time settlement check of $23,000, which he described as a generous gift from his father's good heart. "The law does not reward dedication. Mother, it rewards contracts, and you never signed one," he said with a condescending tilt of his head, as if he were explaining a simple concept to a slow-witted child. Opal felt the edges of her vision begin to blur, and a violent tremor started in her fingertips, so she tucked her hands beneath her thighs, sitting on them to hide her weakness from the predators at the table. She was a world-class mathematician who could balance a $10 million ledger to the penny, yet she could not find a way to make the math of this betrayal add up to anything but total devastation. The silence in the room was a heavy physical pressure, and for the first time in her 74 years, Opal felt the terrifying vertigo of a woman who has just realized the ground beneath her feet was never actually solid. The phone on the table buzzed with a sharp vibration, and Gavin glanced at the screen before sliding it toward Opal so she could see the name of her daughter Joy flashing on the display. When Opal answered with a voice that was barely a whisper, Joy did not ask how her mother was holding up or if she had a place to go, but instead launched into a frantic warning about the family optics. "Stop being so dramatic, Mom, because $23,000 is more than enough for a woman who doesn't even buy new shoes, and you better not make a scene that ruins my charity gala tonight." Joy snapped, her voice tinny and cold through the speaker. The betrayal was now a complete circle of the people Opal had sacrificed her own dreams to elevate and protect, and each one of them was busy measuring the distance between themselves and her suffering. Joy's dismissal was the third layer of the stack, a casual cruelty that suggested Opal's 40 years of labor were nothing more than an inconvenient background noise to their glamorous lives. Nelson and Rhonda began to whisper to each other over a glossy travel brochure for Tahiti, their soft chuckles filling the gaps between Gavin's clinical explanations of the eviction terms. Nelson finally looked at her, then his eyes hard and glinting with a narcissistic triumph that made Opal's stomach turn with a sudden wave of nausea. "Don't look so surprised, Opal, because you spent 40 years counting my money, and did you really think you'd get to keep any of it?" he asked with a smirk that revealed the decades of ungrateful resentment he had hidden behind his charismatic public persona. "You weren't a partner. You were just the help that I happened to sleep with for 40 years, and the help has outlived its usefulness." He continued, his voice devoid of any warmth or shared history. The fourth layer was the realization that the man she had loved was a stranger who had been viewing her as a tool rather than a wife for almost half a century. He slid a set of keys across the wood, but they were not the keys to the luxury SUV he had purchased for himself, or the keys to the $2.2 million estate. They were the keys to a 10-year-old rusted Ford Taurus with a dented fender and a transmission that groaned like a dying animal, a final symbolic insult to a woman who had once managed a fleet of heavy machinery. The final layer of the stack was the deadline which Gavin delivered with a glance at the mahogany grandfather clock in the corner of the office. "You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the family home before the locks are changed, and anything left behind will be considered abandoned property and disposed of by the estate," he said without a hint of irony. Opal stood up her legs, feeling like they were made of dry straw and her heart pounding against her ribs, with a frantic, uneven rhythm that stole her breath. She walked toward the door in a silence that felt deafening, her head held high, even as the walls of her world crumbled into fine grey dust behind her. She did not cry because she knew that tears would be seen as a victory by the people in that room, and she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard the sound of Nelson popping the cork on a bottle of champagne, a celebratory pop that signaled the end of her life as the invisible marrow of the Devereux family. The air in the corridor was cold and sterile, and Opal felt the first true spark of an icy clarity that would soon become her only companion in the desert of her isolation. The transition from the conference room to the house was a blurred nightmare of packing boxes, while the people who were replacing her began to move in before she had even touched the front door. Less than 6 hours after the meeting, a courier arrived at the estate to deliver a formal notice to quit, even though Opal was still in the house and Nelson was currently upstairs in their bedroom. It was a systematic treatment of invisibility designed to make her feel like a ghost haunting a property she no longer possessed, and it was orchestrated with a sadistic efficiency by her own son. Opal lived off black coffee and dry crackers, sleeping in the guest room on a bare mattress, while the sounds of Rhonda's laughter drifted through the vents from the master suite. She kept her old accounting ledgers from the 1980s in a small leather suitcase, a heavy reminder of the thousands of hours she had traded for this moment of absolute rejection. The house smelled of the new floral perfume Rhonda was spraying on the curtains, and the sound of Joy's voice echoed through the halls as she helped her father's mistress choose new colors for the walls Opal had painted with her own hands. On the second morning, Opal walked into her former bedroom to find Joy throwing her collection of vintage quilts into a large black trash bag, her face twisted into a look of bored irritation. "These are just dusty rags. Mom and we need the space for Rhonda's designer linens, so I'm donating them to a thrift store if the moths haven't gotten to them first," Joy said, without looking up from her task. The quilts were the only things Opal had left from her own grandmother, each stitch a record of a family history that was being discarded as if it were nothing more than a nuisance. When Opal tried to protest, Joy simply sighed and told her to stop being so sentimental because she needed to focus on her future and stop clinging to the past. The cruelty was becoming a constant ambient noise, a relentless stripping away of her identity and her memories, until there was almost nothing left but the silver in her hair and the calluses on her hands. Opal realized then that her daughter didn't just want her gone. She wanted the very idea of Opal erased from the house so that the social optics of the new family could remain pristine and untroubled by the truth. The final micro-scene of humiliation occurred that afternoon when Opal returned from a quick trip to the grocery store to buy a gallon of water for the long drive ahead of her. She found that the locks had been changed 3 hours early, and her 2 small suitcases were sitting on the porch in the heat of the Mississippi afternoon, along with her grandmother's silver tea set. Nelson was standing on the other side of the glass door, watching her with an expression of cold indifference, while he adjusted the thermostat for the comfort of the woman inside. Opal stood on the porch for 2 hours, in the sweltering humidity, her sensible shoes hurting her feet, while the neighbors drove by and stared at the woman who had been the foundation of the town's success, now locked out of her own home. The sun beat down on the silver bun of her hair, and she felt the sweat trickling down her back, but she did not bang on the glass or scream for help. She sat on the steps and waited, her vision fixed on the horizon, while she felt the last remnants of her loyalty to the Devereaux name wither and die in the heat of the day. While sitting in the dim light of the public library later that evening, Opal used a computer with a flickering screen to browse a tax-delinquent website, seeking any shelter that her $23,000 could afford. Her eyes caught a listing for a house in Neshoba County for exactly $7, a price so low it seemed like a typo or a cruel joke until she read the description. The Boudreaux cottage was described as having a catastrophic structural floor failure and a history of being vacant for 80 years because of a local curse that kept the superstitious away from its gates. To anyone else, the house was a pile of rotting lumber. But to a mathematician who saw the world in structural patterns, it was a problem that had a solution if one was willing to look beneath the surface. "I would rather live on a broken floor than under the thumb of a man who thinks I am worth nothing," Opal whispered to the empty air of the library, her finger hovering over the mouse. She clicked the buy button with a hand that had finally stopped shaking her mind, already beginning to calculate the weight of the timber and the angle of the joists. The final morning in Tupelo was a grey and heavy affair, the sky draped in low clouds that smelled of rain and exhaust fumes from the busy construction depot down the road. Opal packed the 2 suitcases into the back of the rusted Ford Taurus, her grandmother's silver tea set, wrapped in a faded cardigan and the 1980s ledgers tucked securely under the driver's seat. She did not go inside to say goodbye to Nelson or Gavin or Joy, because she knew that there were no words left that could bridge the chasm they had dug between them. The house was a silent monument to a life of sacrifice that had been repaid with a check that wouldn't cover the cost of a new roof, and she felt a sudden and profound sense of relief as she turned the key in the ignition. The engine groaned and rattled the dashboard, vibrating with a rhythmic metal-on-metal sound, but it started on the first try, a small miracle in a week of disasters. As she backed down the driveway, she didn't look in the rearview mirror because she was too busy focusing on the road ahead and the 3-hour drive toward a broken floor in Neshoba County. She drove through the outskirts of town, passing the construction supply yard, where the trucks she had helped pay for were lined up like a row of yellow soldiers, waiting for orders. She saw the sign that read Devereaux Construction Supplies, Building the Future, and felt a sharp pang of irony as she realized she was the only one in the history of that company who truly knew how the foundation had been laid. The world saw a stoic 74-year-old woman in a dented car, but Opal felt like a soldier returning from a long and bloody war she had finally lost, but survived. The air in the car was hot and smelled of old upholstery and dust, but it was the first air she had breathed in 40 years that didn't belong to Nelson Vance Devereaux. She was headed toward a place that everyone else had discarded, and for the first time in her life she felt a strange and terrifying sense of belonging with the broken things of the world. She was a mathematician who had lost her variables, but she still knew the fundamental laws of the universe, and one of those laws was that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The 3-hour drive toward Philadelphia, Mississippi, was a journey through a landscape of pine forests and red clay, where the humidity seemed to thicken with every mile she traveled south. She watched the odometer of the rusted Taurus turn over with a steady click-click-click, a rhythm that matched the beating of her own heart as she moved further away from the mahogany tomb of her past. She had 30 days to find a permanent solution, but she already knew that the Boudreaux cottage was her final stand, a $7 gamble on a life she was finally claiming for herself. The image of the warped floorboards from the listing stayed in her mind, a rhythmic wave of wood that she sensed was hiding something more than just rot or decay. She was a woman who had spent her life managing the dirt so that others could enjoy the gold, and she was beginning to suspect that the dirt of Neshoba County was holding a secret that was older and more powerful than anything Nelson could imagine. The rain began to fall as she crossed the county line, a soft Mississippi drizzle that washed the Tupelo dust off the windshield and made the pine trees glow like emeralds in the fading light. As she pulled onto Whispering Cypress Lane, the silence of the woods was so profound, it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath in anticipation of her arrival. Opal parked the car in front of a cottage that was almost entirely engulfed by the green vines of kudzu, its porch sagging like a tired smile, and its windows clouded with 80 years of Mississippi grime. She did not get out of the car immediately, but sat there with her hands on the steering wheel, listening to the sound of the rain hitting the rusted metal roof of the Taurus. She looked at the house she had bought for the price of a ham sandwich and felt a surge of a strange and wild hope that defied every mathematical law she had ever learned. She had walked away from the millions and the estate and the family she had built, and she had arrived at a ruin that was just as broken as she was. Opal opened the car door and stepped out into the mud, her head held high, and her silver hair catching the last light of the day as she walked toward the front door without looking back. The 3-hour drive from the polished lies of Tupelo toward the humid heart of Neshoba County felt like a slow descent into a world that time and progress had intentionally forgotten. As the odometer on the rusted Ford Taurus clicked with a rhythmic metallic fatigue, Opal watched the landscape surrender its manicured lawns and corporate signs for the chaotic embrace of ancient pines and red clay ditches. By the time she turned onto Whispering Cypress Lane, the air had thickened into a heavy soup of pine resin and damp earth that seemed to coat the inside of her lungs with every breath she took. The cottage at number 114 was barely visible beneath a suffocating blanket of green kudzu that moved in the wind like the heavy breathing of a sleeping beast. When the engine finally shuddered into a silent rest, the quiet was so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the windows of the car. Opal sat with her hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, staring at the sagging porch and the clouded glass of the windows, realizing that she had traded a mansion of betrayal for a ruin of absolute uncertainty. Stepping out of the car into the soft mud of the driveway, Opal felt the 74 years of her life settle into her joints with a sudden and punishing gravity. The Boudreaux cottage did not welcome her so much as it dared her to cross the threshold into its 80 years of accumulated silence and decay. As she climbed the 3 steps of the porch, the wood groaned beneath her sensible shoes, a sound that echoed through the trees like a warning from the past. The air inside the small structure was a preserved capsule of 1947, smelling intensely of cedar shavings, old paper, and the cool metallic tang of a cellar that had never seen the light of day. When she looked down, she saw the living room floor was not flat, but had been pushed upward in a strange and rhythmic wave of cypress planks that looked like the surface of a frozen ocean during a storm. The light of the late afternoon filtered through the cracked shutters in dusty golden shafts, illuminating the thick layers of Mississippi grime that covered every surface like a shroud. She stood in the center of the room, a woman who had once managed a $310,000 business, now standing in a $7 ruin that was as broken as she felt. The first night in the cottage was an exercise in a primal and unfiltered type of isolation that Opal had never encountered during her decades of domestic servitude. Without electricity or running water, the house became a cavern of shifting shadows, where every creak of the floorboards sounded like the footsteps of a ghost walking through the corridors of her memory. She did not have a bed, so she cleared a small space in the corner of the kitchen and laid out her faded cardigan and a thin wool blanket she had saved from the trunk of the car. The drone of the cicadas outside was a relentless wall of sound that seemed to mock the silence of her phone, which sat cold and dark in the pocket of her dress. There were no calls from Joy to check on her safety, and no messages from Gavin regarding the logistics of her survival, because to them she was already a closed chapter in a book they had long since finished. She sat in the dark, hugging her knees to her chest, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the cypress walls, feeling the immense weight of the Mississippi woods closing in around her. The darkness was not just an absence of light, but a presence that seemed to ask her why she was still breathing, when everything she had built had been stolen away. As the hours toward midnight stretched into a thin wire of exhaustion, Opal experienced the night of her true emotional breaking, a moment where the stoicism she had practiced for 39 years finally shattered like glass on stone. The fear was not a dramatic or cinematic thing, but a cold and steady realization that she was a 74-year-old woman alone in a ruin who could die in her sleep and not be found until the kudzu had claimed her bones. She began to cry, then not with the loud sobs of a victim, but with the silent and gut-wrenching tremors of a woman who was mourning the theft of her own life. She thought of the 4:30 a.m. wake-up calls, the cold ham sandwiches at a metal desk, and the millions of dollars she had calculated for a man who didn't even think she was worth a reliable car. The injustice of it felt like a physical poison in her blood, making her throat raw, and her heart beat with a frantic, uneven rhythm that stole the air from the room. She was terrified that Nelson had been right, that she was just the help, and that without his orbit she was a star that had already burned out. In the absolute blackness of the Neshoba night, Opal Marie Devereaux felt the terrifying vertigo of a soul that had lost its anchor and was drifting into a void where no numbers could ever bring order back to the chaos. She woke up on the cold floor just as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the shutters, turning the dust motes into tiny sparks of silver floating in the stagnant air. The transition from the night of despair to the morning of survival was not marked by a grand epiphany, but by the simple and undeniable sound of a mockingbird singing in the cypress tree outside the window. Opal sat up, her back aching with a sharp and persistent fire, but as she looked at her calloused hands, she noticed how the morning sun made the old wood of the walls glow with a rich and burnished copper hue. The house was not rotting into the earth, as she had first feared, but seemed to be held together by a stubborn and ancient strength that resonated with the steel in her own spine. She realized in that quiet moment that she was still a mathematician, and that while the variables of her life had changed, the fundamental laws of her existence remained the same. She was alive. Her mind was sharp, and for the first time in 4 decades, there was no one waiting in the next room to demand her silence or her labor. The decision to stay was not a loud declaration, but a silent adjustment of her internal scales, a calculation that told her that a broken floor was a better foundation than a mansion built on a lie. The first concrete action of her new life began with the opening of a window, a simple task that required Opal to fight against 80 years of rust and stubborn Mississippi grime. When the sash finally gave way with a protesting shriek, the sudden rush of fresh air and the scent of wild honeysuckle filled the room like a long-awaited blessing from the woods. She walked to the rusted Ford Taurus and retrieved her grandmother's silver tea set, wrapping it in a clean cloth, as if it were the most precious cargo in the world. She set the tea set on a dusty mantelpiece, a single point of elegance in a room of ruins, and it served as her first claim of ownership over the space. She found a rusted crowbar in the small shed behind the house, and as she gripped the heavy iron tool, she felt the familiar steadying of her nerves that always came with physical labor. She began to clear the debris from the living room, her silver bun coming loose as she worked with a focused intensity that silenced the voices of Nelson and Rhonda in her mind. She wasn't just cleaning a house, she was prying the layers of the Devereaux family off her soul, and with every sweep of the broom she felt a little bit of the invisible marrow returning to its rightful place. By the middle of the second afternoon, a cloud of red dust signaled the arrival of a visitor, a battered pickup truck that rumbled up the overgrown driveway and came to a stop near the porch. A woman with deep bronze skin and eyes that looked like they had seen every sunrise in Neshoba County stepped out of the vehicle, holding a large thermos and a heavy-duty pry bar. This was May Kilpatrick, a historian for the Choctaw Nation, who lived 3 miles down the road and who had been watching the smoke from Opal's small cooking fire with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You are either the bravest woman in Mississippi or the most desperate," May said, her voice like the sound of dry leaves skittering across a stone floor as she offered the thermos to the silver-haired stranger on the porch. Opal took the coffee, her fingers trembling slightly, as the warmth of the liquid and the unexpected kindness of the gesture broke through the last of her defenses. For the first time since the mahogany room in Tupelo, Opal didn't try to hide her vulnerability, letting a single tear track through the dust on her cheek as May placed a steady hand on her shoulder. The two women stood in the silence of the woods, a bridge of shared loss and silent understanding forming between them in the heat of the day. May walked into the living room and stopped dead, her gaze fixed on the warped and heaving cypress planks that created that strange rhythmic wave in the center of the floor. "The earth doesn't push up for no reason, Opal, because it only heaves when it is trying to keep a secret safe from the world. May whispered, her voice filled with a reverence that made the hair on Opal's arms stand up. She explained that the house had belonged to Fay Boudreau, a reclusive woman who had disappeared in the late 1940s, leaving behind a legend of a hidden curse and a property that refused to be tamed. Opal looked at the floorboards through the eyes of the mathematician she used to be, noticing how the bowing of the wood followed a precise and intentional pattern that suggested something solid was shifting beneath the house. It wasn't rot or structural failure that was causing the heave, but a series of heavy stone slabs in a shallow cellar that had been lacquered shut decades ago. May handed Opal the heavy-duty pry bar, her eyes glinting with the thrill of a discovery that had been 80 years in the making. The air in the room suddenly felt electric, charged with the scent of ancient beeswax and the metallic tang of something cold and heavy buried deep within the Mississippi dirt. Opal knelt on the dusty floor, the sharp edges of the cypress wood biting into her thin knees as she positioned the tip of the heavy iron pry bar into the first narrow gap between the warped and heaving boards. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was a dull, hollow thud that echoed through the empty house like a heartbeat that had finally found its rhythm after decades of being silenced. With a strength that came from 40 years of suppressed rage and silent dedication, Opal leaned her entire weight into the tool, feeling the ancient nails begin to scream as they were forced out of the cedar joists in a series of sharp, jagged snaps. As the first plank finally splintered and gave way, a smell erupted from the darkness below, a thick and intoxicating mixture of damp red clay beeswax and the cold, dry scent of a tomb that had been sealed since the end of the world. She reached her shaking hand into the dark opening, her fingers brushing against the cold, textured surface of a heavy metal munitions box that was sealed tight with a thick layer of grey protective wax. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel the pulse in her fingertips as she realized that the floor wasn't broken. It was a lid, and what was waiting in the darkness of the Neshoba dirt was about to change the math of her entire life in ways that Nelson could never comprehend. I will now generate the fifth block of the script, detailing the sensory-rich discovery of the Boudreau collection and the strategic documents that will shift the power dynamic in favor of Opal. Opal Marie Devereaux knelt on the dusty floor of the cottage with the heavy iron pry bar gripped in her calloused hands and her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silver bun of her hair had come loose, and the heat of the Mississippi afternoon made the cotton of her dress cling to her skin. But she felt a surge of adrenaline that made her 74 years feel like a distant memory. She positioned the tip of the tool into the narrow gap between the warped cypress boards and leaned her entire weight forward with a grunt of pure, focused determination. The sound of the ancient nails screaming as they were forced out of the cedar joists was a sharp series of jagged snaps that echoed through the empty house like small explosions. As the first long plank finally splintered and gave way, a smell erupted from the darkness below that was thick and intoxicating. It was a mixture of damp red clay and the scent of ancient beeswax, along with the cold and dry aroma of a tomb that had been sealed since the middle of the last century. The darkness beneath the floor was not an empty void of rot, but a structured and intentional space that had been waiting for 80 years to reveal its contents to the right person. As Opal pulled back the second and third boards, she saw the smooth and grey surface of large stone slabs that lined a shallow cellar which had been lacquered shut with a heavy protective sealant. The symmetry of the masonry was a language that the mathematician in her understood immediately, because it was a design meant to survive the humidity and the weight of time. She reached her hand into the opening, and her fingertips brushed against the cold and textured surface of a heavy metal munitions box that was sealed tight with a thick layer of industrial wax. The clink of the metal against the stone was a hollow and rhythmic sound that vibrated up her arm and settled in the marrow of her bones. She felt the immense weight of the object, and as she dragged it into the dusty light of the living room, she realized that the floor was not a failure, but a shield that had protected a fortune from the world. May Kilpatrick stood over her with the heavy-duty pry bar held ready, and her eyes wide with a reverence that matched the silence of the surrounding woods. Together the two women worked in a focused and rhythmic harmony to break the seals of the first box, using the edge of the iron tool to chip away at the stubborn grey wax. When the lid finally creaked open, With a protesting groan, the air in the cottage seemed to vibrate with a sudden and electric charge of history. Nestled in a bed of dry cedar shavings and fine linen were the first of the artifacts that Fay Boudreau had hidden away in 1947. Opal reached down and lifted a terracotta figurine of a woman holding a child, her fingers trembling as she felt the smooth and eggshell-like texture of the fired clay. The eyes of the figure were inlaid with small and shimmering river pearls that caught the golden shafts of the afternoon sun. It was a piece of Choctaw history that was so pristine and so beautiful that Opal felt the breath leave her lungs in a sharp gasp of wonder. The first box was merely the beginning of a tally that would eventually reach 34 heavy metal containers, each filled with the treasures of a people who had been forced to leave their home. As they opened the subsequent boxes, they found ceremonial bowls and intricate effigy jars and funerary urns that dated back to the early 1800s. The collection was a breathtaking display of artistry and resilience, and Opal knew enough about the value of rare antiquities to realize that the 1,600 pieces represented a fortune of at least $1.8 million. Each piece was wrapped in protective layers of beeswax paper and catalogued with a precision that Opal recognized as the work of a brilliant and meticulous mind. The sheer scale of the discovery was a mathematical impossibility that had become a tangible reality in the middle of a $7 ruin. She realized that she was holding more wealth in her wrinkled palms than Nelson had ever earned in a lifetime of moving gravel and selling the labor of others. Inside the very first box, beneath the layer of ceramic figurines, was a leather-bound diary with the name Fay Boudreau embossed in fading gold leaf on the cover. Opal opened the book to the final entry, dated October of 1947, and felt the voice of the reclusive ethnologist speaking directly to her soul through the elegant cursive script. The words written on the yellowed parchment spoke of a life spent protecting the beauty of a people who had been displaced, and a warning that the treasures must never fall into the hands of those who only valued the gold. Fay had written that she hoped the person who found the boxes would be someone who knew what it felt like to be forced out, and who would use the treasure to find their way home. Opal read the words twice, and her tears fell onto the page as she realized that her own displacement had led her to the only person who could truly understand her pain. The emotional weight of the letter was a level of validation that no divorce settlement or bank account could ever provide to a woman who had been silenced for 40 years. The discovery reached its third and most devastating level when Opal reached the bottom of the 12th box and found a series of original 19th century survey maps and land deeds. These were not just historical records, but legal documents that detailed the exact boundaries and easements of the properties in the surrounding counties, including the land in Tupelo. As she spread the maps out on the dusty floorboards, the mathematician in her began to overlay the current topography with the ancient lines of the original surveys. She found a specific document marked with a red wax seal that detailed a neglected historical preservation easement on a 247-acre plot of land. This was the exact location where the primary construction depot of Devereaux Construction Supplies sat, and Opal realized that she had unknowingly been paying the taxes on this easement for years through the business accounts. The documents proved that the land Nelson believed he owned with absolute authority was actually subject to strict federal protections that could halt his operations in an instant. The strategic value of the maps was a weapon that Gavin had never anticipated when he sat in that mahogany room and spoke about the cold reality of contracts and statutes. Opal looked at the intricate lines of the survey and saw the vulnerability of the empire that her husband and son had stolen from her. She realized that by maintaining the tax records for 40 years, she had preserved the very chain of evidence that would now allow her to dismantle their legacy from the inside out. The power dynamic in her mind began to shift with a violent and liberating clarity as she understood that she held the legal standing to challenge the very foundation of Nelson's wealth. She was no longer a discarded piece of office equipment, but the primary guardian of a legacy that the law was obligated to protect. The silence of the cottage was now filled with the sound of a woman who was beginning to calculate the cost of a reckoning that would shake the very earth beneath the feet of her enemies. May Kilpatrick watched her friend with a steady and knowing gaze as the two of them sat amidst the sea of terracotta, and ancient maps in the fading light. "We are going to need more than a pry bar to handle what comes next, Opal, because the world is going to want a piece of this dream, and the vultures are already circling," May said with a voice that was as firm as the stone cellar. Opal nodded her head, and her eyes glinted with a sharp and icy determination that had been forged in the desert of her isolation. She told May that they would spend the next 6 months cataloging every single piece and creating a digital database that would be the gold standard for archaeological records. She would use her $23,000 settlement not for food or furniture, but for the highest quality archival supplies and a security system that would turn the cottage into a fortress. The mathematician was back at her desk, but this time she was not balancing the ledgers for a man who hated her, but for a people who had been forgotten and for a future she was finally claiming as her own. The physical labor of the reconstruction began in the weeks that followed as Silas and Ben, the 2 local men from the community, joined Opal and May in the restoration of the Boudreau cottage. They worked with a reverence that transformed the ruin into a temple of history, and the bowed floor was replaced with reinforced glass viewing panels that showed the stone cellar below. The thick blankets of kudzu were cleared away to reveal a garden of native Mississippi plants, and the cedar walls were polished until they glowed like copper in the afternoon sun. Opal felt her energy returning with every artifact she cleaned and every entry she made into her new ledger. She was no longer the invisible marrow in the bones of a family that didn't want her, but the vibrant heart of a cultural center that was beginning to attract the attention of historians from across the country. The transformation of the exile into a place of power was nearly complete, and Opal could feel the weight in her chest beginning to lift as she moved through the rooms of her new home. The news of the Boudreau collection eventually reached the front page of the heritage section of the largest newspapers, and the name of Opal Marie Devereux was suddenly associated with brilliance and resilience rather than failure. She watched from her porch as the world began to take notice of the $7 savior and the treasure she had pulled from the Mississippi dirt. She was a woman who was now financially secure with a consultancy that recognized her unique skill set, and she felt a sense of peace that was more valuable than all the millions in the world. But she knew that the peace was only a temporary lull before the final storm, because she could already hear the sound of luxury cars rumbling up Whispering Cypress Lane. Nelson and Gavin and Joy were coming to claim what they believed was theirs by right of blood and marriage, and they had no idea that Opal was waiting for them with a floor that was no longer broken but was now a stage for their ultimate defeat. As the first black SUV turned into the overgrown driveway and kicked up a cloud of red dust, Opal stood on the porch with her head held high and her silver hair catching the light. She looked down at the documents in her hand and the ancient figurine on the table beside her, and felt a surge of a strange and wild joy. The predators were coming back to the scene of the crime, but they were about to find out that the woman they had discarded was the only one who knew how to read the maps they were desperately seeking. She stood in the silence of the Neshoba woods, listening to the engine of the luxury car shut off, and the sound of her son's expensive shoes hitting the gravel. The math of her life was about to be solved once and for all, and as she reached for the handle of the door, she felt the first true breath of a justice that was 80 years in the making. But what the Devereux family did not realize was that the treasure under the floorboards was not the only thing that had been waiting in the dark to strike back at the people who had forgotten the value of a soul. 14 months had passed since the day Opal Marie Devereux first stepped into the red mud of Neshoba County, and the Boudreau cottage no longer looked like a dying beast surrendered to the kudzu, but like a radiant temple of history. The thick green vines had been cleared away to reveal the rich burnished copper of the 100-year-old cypress walls, which now glowed in the Mississippi sun with a vibrancy that seemed to hum from within. A garden of native coreopsis and purple coneflowers danced in the light, where the weeds once choked the earth, and the air around the porch was filled with the sweet scent of lavender and clean pine. Inside the living room, the bowed and broken floorboards had been replaced by reinforced glass panels that revealed the stone-lined cellar below a transparent window into a past that was finally safe. Opal stood in the center of the room, wearing an elegant emerald silk scarf that caught the silver in her hair, and her posture was no longer stooped by the weight of the Devereux ledgers, but was as straight and unyielding as a cedar beam. She was a woman who had reclaimed her own coordinates, and as she looked at her reflection in the polished glass, she saw a mathematician who had finally solved for her own worth and her own peace. The silence of the whispering cypress woods was shattered by the rhythmic grinding of high-end tires on gravel as a caravan of 3 black luxury SUVs turned into the driveway, kicking up a thick cloud of red dust that hung in the humid air like a veil. Nelson Vance Devereaux was the first to step out, his expensive Italian loafers hitting the dirt with a sense of entitlement that the ancient trees seemed to reject immediately. Behind him came Gavin, adjusting the cuffs of a suit that cost more than the rusted Ford Taurus and Joy, who was already holding her phone up to record the quaintness of the poverty she expected to find at the end of the road. They moved toward the porch, like a pack of wolves who had caught the scent of gold, their faces masks of feigned concern and predatory greed. They smelled of expensive scotch and designer perfume, and the metallic arrogance of people who believed that everything in the world had a price tag they could negotiate or a title they could steal. Nelson looked up at the restored cottage, his eyes narrowing as he realized that the ruin he had discarded was now a trophy that he had no hand in building, and his charismatic smile flickered for a brief second before he composed himself for the performance of a lifetime. They entered the house without knocking, as if the 80 years of history and the 14 months of the labor of Opal were merely an extension of the hallway in their Tupelo estate. The sudden transition from the heat of the porch to the cool and hushed interior of the cultural center stopped them in their tracks, their eyes widening at the sight of the artifacts displayed in museum-grade cases. Joy let out a shallow gasp of genuine surprise, while Gavin moved toward the glass floor panels, his legal mind already calculating the square footage of the wealth beneath his feet. Nelson stood in the doorway, his charismatic mask slipping further as he took in the transformation of the woman he had tried to bury in the forgotten corners of the state. Opal did not move to greet them, and she did not offer them a seat. She simply stood behind a small table holding a single terracotta figurine of a woman holding a child. The silence in the room was a physical barrier that the antagonists could not seem to find a way through, and the sound of their own heavy breathing felt like a clumsy intrusion into a space that had been consecrated by the silence and the study of a woman they had once called the Help. Nelson was the first to break the quiet, his voice dropping into the low and reverent register he used when he was trying to close a major contract or win over a hostile audience at a town hall meeting. He took a step forward and reached out a hand as if to touch the arm of Opal, telling her that he had been unable to sleep since she left, and that he had realized his mistake in allowing the divorce to proceed so coldly. He spoke of his regret and his desire to bring her home to the Tupelo estate, claiming that he missed her spirit and that the house felt like a tomb without her quiet and steady presence. Opal looked at him with a level of clarity that made his words feel like thin grey smoke, and she did not blink as she watched him try to weave a web of false nostalgia around her. When he finally paused for a breath, she responded with a voice that was as calm and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, telling him that he did not come for her, but that he came for the clay. She told him that the clay knew the difference between a builder and a destroyer, and that his presence in her home was a debt she was no longer interested in collecting from a man whose soul was as empty as his promises. Gavin stepped forward, then his voice a clinical drone of statutes and threats, as he informed his mother that they had come to discuss the legal status of the artifacts under the rules of marital property. He claimed that since the house was purchased with marital funds, and the discovery was made before the final distribution of assets was complete, the $1 million collection belonged to the family estate. He spoke of the $23,000 check as a down payment on a larger share, and warned her that he had already prepared a series of injunctions to freeze her access to the Boudreaux Cultural Center. He told her that the law rewarded those who knew how to claim their property, and that she had no standing to keep a fortune that was built on the back of the business of his father. Opal listened to her son with a look of profound pity, her silver pen tapping rhythmically against the table, as she waited for him to finish his long and empty lecture. She told him that she had taught him how to read the law, but that she had clearly forgotten to teach him how to read a room, and that his legal standing in Neshoba County was as hollow as the mahogany walls of the room where he had once tried to erase her. At that moment, May Kilpatrick stepped out from the back office, followed by 3 men in dark suits who carried the authority of a sovereign nation in the way they stood and watched the intruders with a cold and steady gaze. May introduced them as the legal counsel for the Choctaw Nation and the representatives of the federal government acting under the authority of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. She explained with a voice like dry leaves skittering on stone that the 1,600 pieces of ceramic pottery were protected indigenous property and could never be claimed as white man's spoils or marital assets. The artifacts did not belong to Opal, and they certainly did not belong to the Devereaux estate, as they were legally recognized as the cultural heritage of a people who were finally coming home after decades of being hidden in the dark. Gavin's face went pale as he realized that the federal statutes he usually used to bully small contractors were now a wall he could not climb, and that he had spent $50,000 in legal fees to chase a prize that was federally protected and forever out of his reach. Opal took a final document from her table and slid it across the glass floor toward Nelson, her eyes glinting with a sharp and icy determination that signaled the end of the game they had been playing. She told him to look at the red wax seal on the 19th century survey map and the historical preservation easement that she had discovered in the Boudreaux boxes during her long months of study. This document proved that the land where the primary construction depot sat in Tupelo was actually a protected site, and that because Opal had maintained the taxes on the easement for 40 years, she was the only one with the standing to enforce the protection. She informed him that she had already filed a petition with the state to halt all operations at the depot, to allow for an extensive archaeological survey of the ground beneath his heavy machinery and his million-dollar trucks. "You told me I was the help, Nelson, but you forgot that the help is the one who knows where all the leaks are, and I have decided to retire and take the foundation with me," she said with a finality that made the air in the room feel thin and cold. The reaction of the antagonists was a chaotic display of impotent rage and superficial vanity that only served to confirm the justice of the victory of Opal over the people who had discarded her. Nelson began to scream about his rights and his legacy, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, while Gavin stared at the maps with the blank expression of a man who has just seen his entire career go up in smoke. Joy attempted to take a selfie with one of the ceremonial bowls, as if the moment were merely a backdrop for her social media optics, but she was sternly rebuked by May and forced to lower her phone in a state of absolute shame. They realized then that there was no manager to call and no court they could buy that would give them back the power they had so arrogantly discarded in that mahogany conference room. They were 3 small and bitter people standing in a temple of history that they were not worthy to enter, and the contrast between their noisy arrival and their quiet defeat was the most satisfying math Opal had ever calculated in her 74 years. The poetic justice that followed their departure from the cottage was as mechanical and precise as the equations Opal had used to balance the books for 39 years of silent dedication. Without the meticulous oversight and the mathematical brilliance of his ex-wife, Nelson failed to notice a massive embezzlement scheme that Rhonda Capps had been running through the secondary accounts for over a decade. Rhonda was eventually caught at the border with $80,000 of the company cash hidden in the lining of her designer luggage, and she was sentenced to 18 months in a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud and theft. Nelson was forced into a humiliating bankruptcy within 8 months, as the state ordered the permanent closure of his construction depot to protect the historical site Opal had revealed. The man who had sought a second youth and a life of gold ended up living in a small rented apartment with a rusted car and a mailbox full of past due notices. He discovered too late that the woman he called the help was actually the only thing that had been keeping the walls of his life from crumbling into the red dirt of Mississippi. Gavin's reputation as a shark lawyer was permanently ruined after the Choctaw Nation filed a formal complaint with the Bar Association regarding his illegal attempt to seize tribal artifacts, and he was suspended from the practice of law for 2 years. He found himself a social pariah in the legal circles of Tupelo, a man who had been outmaneuvered by his own mother and whose arrogance had become a cautionary tale for every young attorney in the state. Joy fared no better as Rhonda Capps had vanished with the remaining liquid assets of the family estate, leaving Joy to pay for the medical care of her father and her own mounting debts. She was forced to sell her collection of designer handbags and her luxury SUV just to keep the lights on in her shrinking world, and she eventually had to take a job as a junior clerk in a department store. The woman who had mocked the sensible shoes of her mother was now spending her long days on her feet for minimum wage, learning the hard way that a legacy built on the suffering of others is a house of cards that the wind will always find. As the sound of the luxury SUVs faded into the distance, and the dust of their departure settled back into the red clay of Whispering Cypress Lane, the silence of the woods returned with a profound and healing weight. Opal stood on the porch for a long time, watching the shadows of the cypress trees stretch across the garden as the sun began its slow and golden descent toward the horizon. The predators were gone, and the history was safe, and the math of her life had finally reached a perfect and unshakable balance that no one would ever be allowed to disrupt again. She felt the cool evening breeze on her face, carrying the scent of wild honeysuckle and the damp earth of the Mississippi woods, and she realized that she was no longer a woman defined by her sacrifices. She was the architect of her own peace and the guardian of a treasure that was more valuable than all the millions of Nelson Devereaux. The world saw a 77-year-old woman standing alone in the woods, but Opal felt like a queen who had finally come into her kingdom, and the weight in her chest that had been there for 40 years simply vanished into the clear air. When she finally went back inside and closed the heavy cypress door against the approaching night, Opal sat on the edge of the reinforced glass floor and allowed herself to breathe in a way she had not since 1987. The tears came then, but they were not the bitter tears of the mahogany conference room or the frightened tears of that first night in the ruin of the cottage. They were the slow and quiet tears of a woman who was experiencing the absolute and unadulterated relief of being seen and being safe and being whole. She wept for the girl who had abandoned her scholarship, and for the woman who had balanced the books in a windowless room, and for the grandmother whose quilts had been tossed aside like dusty rags. She cried until her throat was clear, and her heart felt light, and the silence of the cottage was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard in her long and storied life. As she wiped her eyes and looked down at the ancient terracotta figurine, she knew that her story was far from over, but for the first time she was the one holding the pen. But as she prepared for her first night of true peace, a letter arrived in the late mail that suggested her victory in Neshoba County was only the first chapter in a much larger and more dangerous historical reckoning. 3 years have passed since the dust of the luxury SUVs settled back into the red clay of Neshoba County, and the rhythm of life for Opal Marie Devereaux has found a frequency that no ledger could ever contain. Every morning now begins not with the jarring alarm of a woman terrified of a missing penny, but with the soft golden light filtering through the lace curtains of a bedroom that smells of sun-dried linen and fresh cedar. Opal wakes at 6:30, when the birds are already in full chorus, and she moves through the rooms of the Boudreau cottage with a fluidity that speaks of a body finally at peace with its own history. She makes a pot of tea in her grandmother's silver set and sits on the porch watching the mist rise off the cypress swamp like a curtain being lifted on a new act. There is no longer a windowless office or a plain ham sandwich eaten in a hurry, because her days are now measured in the blooming of the flowers and the laughter of the children who come to hear the stories of the clay. The silence that once felt like a prison is now a comfortable companion, and she realizes that the 77-year-old woman in the mirror is not a survivor of a tragedy, but the architect of a masterpiece. The Boudreau Cultural Center has become a world-renowned sanctuary for history and a beacon of resilience that draws scholars and dreamers from every corner of the country. Opal spends her afternoons in the main hall, where the glass floor panels allow the light to dance across the ancient stone cellar and the 1,600 pieces of Choctaw pottery. She is no longer the invisible marrow of a failing empire, but a highly sought-after consultant earning $96,000 a year to help other communities preserve their forgotten legacies. She established the Boudreau Devereaux Scholarship specifically for women over 50 who were told their dreams had an expiration date, and she watches with a fierce pride as the first recipients begin their own journeys of rediscovery. Her bank account is full, but her heart is fuller because she knows that the value she created is being used to build foundations that will never crumble. She is a mathematician who has finally accounted for the human spirit, and she finds that the sum total of a life, lived with integrity, is a fortune that the markets of the world can never truly quantify or steal. The gates of the cottage remain closed to Nelson and Gavin, whose names are now synonymous with the very greed and arrogance that led to their own spectacular undoing in the courts of public opinion. Opal refuses to answer the desperate letters that Nelson sends from his small rented apartment, where he spends his days staring at the past due notices and the ghosts of the millions he threw away. However, she has allowed a fragile and conditional bridge to be built with Joy, who travels from Tupelo once a month to seek a connection that she spent 38 years ignoring. The reconciliation is not a return to the old hierarchies, but a new and disciplined arrangement, where Joy must spend 3 hours working in the native garden to earn her lunch at the small wooden table on the porch. Opal watches her daughter pull weeds and prune the lavender, seeing the blisters on the hands of the woman who once mocked the calluses of her mother. It is a slow and quiet education in the value of labor and the weight of a soul, and while the relationship may never be fully healed, it is at least honest. Opal has learned that forgiveness does not mean giving back the keys to your heart, but rather showing others how to build a house worth living in. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, while sitting in the garden with May Kilpatrick, Opal watched a young girl trace the patterns on a replica of the woman holding a child figurine with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. May turned to her with a smile that was etched with the wisdom of the woods, and asked if she ever missed the mahogany panels and the marble floors of the estate in Tupelo. Opal looked at the vibrant yellow flowers and the sturdy cypress walls of her home, and felt a surge of a strange and wild gratitude for the day she lost everything. She told May that a house with a broken floor is infinitely better than a mansion with a broken soul, and that sometimes you have to tear up the very ground you stand on to find the gold that was always beneath your feet. She realized that the $7 she spent at that blind auction was the best investment of her life because it bought her the permission to finally become herself. The end of the Devereaux Empire was not a tragedy, but the necessary demolition required to reveal the ancient and unshakable truth of her own worth. She is a woman who found her way home through a ruin, and she knows now that the only numbers that truly matter are the ones that represent the love you give and the peace you keep. My heart is truly overflowing with gratitude for you having stayed here with Opal through every single moment of this long and winding journey, from the cold conference rooms to the warm Mississippi woods. There is something profoundly powerful about witnessing a woman reclaim her dignity when the world tried to tell her she was nothing more than a discarded piece of office equipment. If this story has touched a chord in your soul, or if you have ever felt like your years of silent dedication were being overlooked, then I want you to know that your harvest is coming too. We often find ourselves standing on a broken floor, terrified of the shadows beneath us without realizing that the very cracks we fear are the only way the light can reach the treasures we have forgotten. Opal's story is a reminder that justice is not always a loud and sudden thing, but a slow and mechanical process that rewards the persistent and the honest. You have been a vital part of this chronicle, and your presence here today is a testament to the fact that stories of resilience and poetic justice still have the power to move the world. If you have ever been subestimated because of your age, or if someone you loved tried to make you believe that your worth was tied to a contract you never signed, then I want to hear from you. Please leave a single word in the comments today that describes how you feel after seeing Opal stand her ground against the predators who tried to steal her life. Whether it is justice or freedom or peace, your word is a seed that helps this community grow stronger and reminds others that they are not alone in their struggle, that your value is not a line item in someone else's budget, and that your dedication is a foundation that only you have the right to claim. That true success is measured by the strength of your character and not the size of your estate. That it is never too late to pry up the floorboards of a broken situation to find the gold that was always beneath your feet. That the people who try to bury you often forget that you are a seed and your time to bloom is entirely up to you. Please share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their best chapters are still waiting to be written, and don't forget to subscribe to join our growing family. This has been another chronicle of the human spirit, and I will see you in the next harvest.